Good morning, everyone, and again, happy Pentecost Sunday. It's always nice when Pentecost Sunday does not fall on Memorial Day weekend, because I find some churches get the two confused. And they if they're on the same weekend, it's often they'll forget about Pentecost Sunday because they're having everyone, all the veterans. This is always nice. Not that there's anything wrong with the veterans standing up, but it's nice to have them as two separate weekends. Okay, so this is our last week, right? That's correct.
Right.
This is our last week, and so let's just recap just for a very few minutes here, just to get everyone up to speed. I don't know how many of you have been here for all 4 weeks, or how many of you are maybe here for the first time. I don't know. But we are discussing this question of this issue of Christian nationalism and the idea of, was America founded as a Christian nation? We're kind of addressing this question historically. So when we see people making appeals in the press to things like Christian nationalism, you'll at least be able to be a little more informed. Again, there's not much we can do here in a 45 minutes a week, but I do hope, as I've said now a couple of times, that we can get you some kind of resources and get you to sort of reorient your thinking a little bit on this subject, in the hopes that, some of you may want to dig in a little deeper to this question. So in the first week, we defined our terms, right? What does Christian nationalism mean? What is the difference between Christian nationalism and what we call civil religion? In week 2, we got into the 18th century, the Revolution. We talked about the Bible and the way the founding fathers and ministers of the day used the Bible. Last week, we talked about some of the documents, some of the most important documents, and the role religion played in specifically the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, and then also talked a little bit at the end about some of the state constitutions and the role of religion there. Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about, how the founding fathers, saw religion in relationship to the nation that they were building, right? What was the religious vision for the nation that the founding fathers had? And I think it's important to realize, and I think I said this in response to somebody's question last week, I think it's important to realize that the founding fathers, the men who were present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the creators of the Constitution, you remember, these men are not ministers, they're not theologians, they're not religious scholars in any way, shape, or form. They're statesmen. They've studied politics, they've studied political ideas, they're trying to build a republic. So we have to be careful turning to them to, solidify or understand our Christian faith, right? They were not in the business of articulating Christian theology or Christian faith. But they did think about, when they thought about religion, they did think about religion in relationship to how religion might serve the nation that they were building, the country that they were trying to build. I think that's important to remember. So often you see people wanting to suggest that, whatever the founders believed about Christianity was true or right, or, necessarily like they were like trying to articulate what a Christian is. Very few of them actually did that. They were just using Christianity as a way to help them understand how a republic works, how a republic survives. And then it's also important, I've mentioned this book that I wrote called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? In that book, I talk about some of the leading founders and their religious beliefs. And I think it's very dangerous to kind of say the founding fathers believed this about religion. The founding fathers were Christians. The founding fathers were deists. The founding fathers were something else. Because very rarely did they have the same opinions about religious things. They were a very kind of diverse group who often disagreed among themselves about how to think about religion as it relates to the American government that they were trying to create. So I think that's another important kind of introductory point to make here as we start thinking about just what role they believed religion did have in the Republic. So with that in mind, I think the central foundational religious doctrine or belief that the founding fathers talked about, perhaps more than any other, was this idea of religious liberty. If there was, I'm going to go back on what I just said now, if there was a unifying concept that the founding fathers all embraced to a man, it was the belief that human beings should be able to worship God in the way that they want to worship God, or not worship God at all, or worship some other God, or be an atheist, right? In other words, the government should not be interfering in any way, shape, or form on how one worships, as long as that worship falls, within the bounds of the law. If there was a form of religion that, glorified, say, murder or something, that wouldn't have been accepted, because it would have butted up against, of course, the laws of the land. So I want to talk a little bit about how the founding fathers understood religious liberty, no matter what their personal religious convictions were. How did they understand this idea of religious liberty? So the two images you see here on the screen right now are, on the right is the Touro, Touro, the Touro Synagogue in Providence, Rhode Island, which is the oldest synagogue still standing in the United States. This was not the first Jewish congregation in the United States. That one was in New York. But this is the longest running congregation in the United States. And on the left is I may have put this up last week, is just a little clip here of, and again, I'm not expecting you to read it, but just a little clip here of Thomas Jefferson's statute on religious liberty. So I'm gonna show you some sort of documents here today and point a few things out. I'm not going to have time to read through all of the words that are on the screen, but I did use the red highlighting feature to highlight some of them. When George Washington becomes the first president of the United States in 1789, he writes a letter to all of the leaders of the major congregations and religious bodies existing in the United States at that time. So he writes letters, say, to the leaders of the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church. He even writes one to this small little sect known as the Swedenborgians, who had this tiny little religious group. But perhaps his most famous letter is his letter to the Jews of the Touro Synagogue, Jews of Newport. And, I've highlighted this red passage here. In all of these letters, Washington affirmed the fact of religious freedom, right? You have the right to religion. So they're in the red. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more than toleration is spoken. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. This is really interesting here, because what George Washington is doing in this text is he is distinguishing between two words that today get often confused: religious freedom and religious toleration. Religious freedom, or liberty of conscience, essentially means you are free to worship any way you want. There's no church, there's no state church, there's no official church. You have the liberty to follow your conscience in matters of religion, wherever that leads. And it may actually lead you away from religion, and that's fine too. The difference between religious liberty or liberty of conscience, religious freedom, and religious toleration is religious toleration said there is a dominant church, there is a state church, right? And we will let other religions worship, right? To be freely worshiped, but their tax money and their tax money will be paid to support the dominant church. So it's, in other words, it's like this. Like, okay, England, right? England has the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And it's this idea that we are the official church. If you're a Presbyterian, we'll let you worship. But your religious taxes still need to go to us, to the Anglican Church. In other words, we don't like you here, but we'll tolerate you, right? That's religious toleration, right? You're not in charge. You're not shaping the religious course of the nation, and we'll just tolerate you, and you can worship the way you want. That is not what Washington is saying here, or what any of the founding fathers believed. They believed in religious freedom, religious liberty. So I think that's an interesting point in this letter to the Jews of Newport in 1790. George Washington, in that thing I have section I have highlighted in red, was making a very clear difference between it is now no more that toleration is spoken of, but rather liberty of conscience. Now let's move over to the next great statement of religious liberty. And that is, I think we mentioned this last class, Thomas Jefferson, a bill for establishing religious freedom. Many historians suggest that this is the greatest statement on religious freedom ever written in the world, at least at this point. And again, we talked a little bit about this last class. In Virginia, Virginia was the most liberal of all the states, the newly formed states, in allowing complete religious freedom. There was no test oath for holding office in Virginia. There was no established church where your tax money went to. Everybody in Virginia was free to worship the way they wanted. And largely it was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who were the strongest supporters of that idea. But one of the things I wanted to point out here with this document is the way in which Jefferson understood it, and the way in which it was debated and discussed among the Virginia state legislature. So listen to this. I'm just going to read this quickly. This is a statement that Jefferson made roughly 30 or so years after 35 years or so after he wrote this bill for establishing religious freedom. And it's in his autobiography, and he goes back and he kind of reflects on this document. Listen to what he says. Listen carefully, and I'll emphasize it as well with my voice. The bill for establishing, again, remember, this is 1821. This bill was passed in 1785. So Jefferson is now, 35, almost 40 years later, remembering the bill he passed, right? This is towards the end of Jefferson's life, he says. The bill for establishing religious freedom, principles of which had to a certain degree been enacted before. So he's saying, like, my bill was not the first religious freedom bill, right? I had gone in all the latitude of reason and right. It still met with opposition, right? There were some that did not want to, one being Patrick Henry, who did not want to give so much religious freedom. Patrick Henry still wanted a kind of religious establishment. But with some mutilations in the preamble, it was finally passed, and a singular proposition proved that protection of opinion was meant to be universal. Now, here's the fascinating part. Where the preamble declares that coercion is a departure from the plan of the author of our holy religion, right? In other words, this is the part of the preamble that says to coerce someone to worship in a certain way goes against our holy religion. While they were debating this, Jefferson says, an amendment was proposed by inserting the word Jesus Christ so that it should read a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion. Right? You see what's going on here. There were some saying, no, we need to put Jesus Christ in there. And then Jefferson says that amendment or that insertion was rejected by a great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection, I'm adding here, not only just the followers of Jesus Christ, but the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mahometan or the Muslim, the Hindu, that's spelled the way Jefferson spelled it, and the infidel of every denomination. Infidel meaning sort of atheist or skeptic. So it's very clear here that there was a debate over whether or not to say, religious liberty belongs only to those who follow Jesus Christ. In other words, we'll give religious liberty to Presbyterians, Baptists, Episcopalians, Anglicans, these things. But Jefferson and the majority of the committee who signed off on this said they were looking forward. Now, you're not going to find many Muslims. You will find some in the slave communities, but you're not going to find good luck finding a Hindu in 18th century America. You're just not going to, there aren't any, right? But what Jefferson is imagining is that one day there will be perhaps diversity. Remember, he says above that this opinion should be universal, right? And so he has the foresight to realize that, America may one day become more religiously diverse, and we want to make sure that all of these world religions have religious liberty. So the group rejects the idea that this is just religious liberty for Christians, that we're not just a Christian country, but more and more people from other nations might come in and other religions might come in, and they have the right to have religious freedom too. So I think that's a very interesting statement there, because so often you hear people say, well, when the founding fathers talked about religious liberty, they were talking about, well, we can't have an established church. That means, there's many on the Christian right who do this. That means the founders said we can't have a Presbyterian established church, or the Baptist can't be. But it didn't mean everybody. It was just generally Christian. And Jefferson makes it clear that is not what he had in mind. Now, having said that, there were people who opposed this idea, but the majority said we need to be more diverse. So maybe I can answer some questions about that during the Q&A section here. Moving quickly now, and I'm just going to check my time here. Here is Benjamin Rush, one of the lesser known founding fathers. Benjamin Rush signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a medical doctor in Philadelphia. And he wrote this famous essay on education, right? How do we educate people in a republic? Again, he writes this, I think, roughly in I think this is in the 1790s. I don't have the date on there. But let me just run through these real quick and just kind of, make a few comments. Rush says, I proceed in the next place to inquire what mode of education we shall adopt so as to secure to the state all the advantages that are to be derived from the proper instructions of youth. And here I beg leave to remark that the only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object and life of all republican governments. So what Rush is saying is that religion is absolutely essential to a good republic. Why? Because religion teaches virtue. Now, when we think of that word virtue, we often think of that word virtue through the mindset of a kind of Christian or a almost Victorian age kind of idea, right? The virtue, the woman is virtuous, right? Warding off the suitors, like it's out of some kind of Victorian novel. Or, we think about it in terms of being moral, right? And in some ways that's true, but the main meaning of the word virtue in the 18th century was a political idea. A virtuous person was someone who was willing to lay aside their own self-interest, even maybe their own individual rights at times, not all the time, but at times, in order to serve the greater good of their fellow citizens. Now, so when Rush says religion is important to creating virtuous citizens, he's suggesting that people who are religious already know how to sacrifice their interests and their rights to something greater than themselves, God, right? Their faith, their fellow believers. Think about in Acts chapter 2 or Acts chapter 4, where, that they were all sacrificing for the greater good of the community, right? Christians understand that. Well, people who are religious understand that, Rush says. And it's that kind of spirit that we also need in order to create a nation. We need people who are willing to be virtuous, people who are willing to sacrifice at times their rights for the greater good. Whether that means, maybe I have the right not to wear a mask during COVID, but the greater good is if I wear a mask, I will help someone else from not getting COVID, right? So I have, I have to sacrifice that right I have to say it's my right not to wear a mask to help others. This is what Rush would say today, I think, if he was living during our COVID masking era. Now, when he talks about religion, Rush, what is he talking about? What does he mean by this word religion? And then he defines that here in this next paragraph. Such is my veneration for every religion that reveals the attributes of the deity or a future state of rewards and punishment. He says, I would rather see the opinions of Confucius or Muhammad, the Muslim prophet, inculcated upon our youth, then see them grow up wholly devoid of a system of religious principles. In other words, if the teachings of Confucius or the teachings of Muhammad would teach people to be virtuous in the way I just described it, sacrificing for the greater good of the republic, then I'd rather have them taught that than nothing about religion. But then look what he goes on to say in the last sentence. Religion I mean to recommend in this place, meaning in America, is that of the New Testament. So Rush believes all these other religions are important, but he's a Christian himself, so he's saying for me and in my place, I think the New Testament offers the best way of how to sacrifice for the greater good. So it's really interesting. He's open to all these other religious systems. At the same time, he's a Christian himself, so he's going to affirm his own faith as the best recommendation for creating virtuous citizens. Now, moving on, just briefly continuing here with Rush. I know there's a lot of words on the screen this time, but I just want to walk you through some of this. I'm trying to move my screen here so I can read it. So here he says, same document, right? Again, I highlighted this in red, but let me just read it real quickly. He says, I do not wish to see our youth educated with a single prejudice against any nation or country. He goes on. Let me just read the red part here. He must be taught, this is a citizen, right? Citizen must be taught to amass wealth, right? So a citizen must learn how to make money, but it must be only to increase his power of contributing to the wants and demands of the state. How about that one? Here he's saying, like, you can make money, but the reason you make money is so that you can help government, help the state, right? Wouldn't really fly very well in today's culture, right? Rush might be accused of being a socialist if he said that today. He goes on there. Citizen must be indulged occasionally in amusements, but he must be taught that study and business should be his principal pursuits in life. In other words, don't get too caught up in things that are going to satisfy your amusements and desires, right? You should be focused on study and business and so forth. Above all, the citizen, he must love life and endeavor to acquire as many of its conveniences as possible by industry and economy. But he must be taught that this life is not his own when the safety of his country requires it. Again, this is sort of language that might not go over very strongly many in today's culture today. He's saying, hey, go out there, enjoy life, love life. But remember, your life is not your own. Now, again, Christians are used to saying this, right? Your life is not your own. It belongs to God. God will direct you. But Rush isn't talking here about Christianity. He's talking about the state. He's talking about the republic, right? He learned these lessons, as you can see in the rest of the quote, from studying the great republics of Greece and Rome, right? In other words, like, your life is not your own. You need to be always ready to give it up and to use it to defend the safety of your country, right? Again, very much a kind of virtue, right? Sacrificing idea. And again, Rush believes that religious citizens are going to be the best people able to perform this kind of virtuous citizenship. Okay, the last thing I just want to touch on here before we open it up for Q&A is the separation of church and state. What did the founders believe about this? I think someone asked a question about this in one of the earlier classes, but let me just talk a little bit about the implications of the founders' beliefs in this. The phrase, the separation of church and state, does not appear in the United States Constitution. As we talked about in the first week, the idea of the separation of church and state was instituted into the legal structures of the society in 1947 with the famous Everson versus Board of Education of New Jersey case. However, there were some people in the era, namely Roger Williams, who was one of the founders of Rhode Island, where the Toro Synagogue was that you just saw, and Thomas Jefferson talked about walls of separation between church and state. What the founding fathers decided to do when they established the Constitution and wrote the First Amendment was to say that there would be no established church. In other words, the church and the state would be two separate entities. This would not be like in England, where there was the Church of England. This would not be like in France, where the Roman Catholic Church was the official state church, right? The leaders of the country did not rule like out of divine right, like they often talked about kings in Europe ruling because God put them on the throne. There would be a complete separation between church and state in terms of there will be no state church. Now, what are the implications of this? When you separate church and state, like the founders did, that means one religion, one form of Christianity or one religion is not privileged over the other religions. So when you have church and state closely aligned with each other, you have a situation in which one church gets the benefit of the religious taxes, the law, one church, all the rituals and so forth of the country revolve around one state church. I mean, think about England and like the royal weddings, right? They're all Anglican services because Anglicanism is the state church, right? You don't have that kind of privilege if you separate church and state. That means you're creating here in this third bullet point I have on the screen, you're creating a kind of religious community, a religious country in which everybody has to compete then. Everyone's on an equal playing field, all the religions, to compete for converts and members. And I'm calling this religious consumerism, right? In other words, the college students at Messiah, they talk about this all the time. When they get onto campus and they're from out of state somewhere, or out of the region, they talk about going shopping, church shopping, right? I'm I'm seeing where I'm going to go. I'm going to visit a bunch of different churches and see which one I like, to attend while I'm here for my 4 years at Messiah. This idea of consumerism, right? You check out a church, you make a choice about a church based upon, well, I like the preacher, I like the music, or I like the youth programs, or I like the Sunday school. So, it's the same way you go around and buy, I like Coke, or I like Pepsi, or I like Ford, or I like Chevy, or I like, people start consuming. This means that the churches, without government helping the churches and funding the churches and propping them up and privileging them, this means that each individual church has to step up its game, right? They have to have a good preacher. They have to have a good Sunday school program, youth program, worship, so forth, because they're now competing against all the other churches for members. And as a result, the churches, again, they really step up their game and they make really successful appeals to people as to why your spiritual needs and wants will be satisfied in this denomination or in this congregation. And what that does is, because the churches do such a good job competing against each other in this free market, if you will, of religion, people start taking them up on their offers. They start going to church. And in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, you have a huge religious revival that takes place in the United States called the Second Great Awakening, in which more people are going, a greater percentage of people are going to religion, finding religion, they're becoming Christians, they're converting. And I would suggest they're doing that simply because of the fact that church and state were separate and not one church controlled everything. Churches then had to appeal to people. And this then led to an increased religiosity. This led to the advancement of the gospel in powerful ways because church and state were separated. I talk here as America being an evangelical Christian culture in these 70 years between 1790 to 1860. American culture was deeply Christian during this time because there was no state church. It was a consumer marketplace. And what did that lead to then? Well, once all of these churches begin to flourish and more people are joining, there's this huge revival known as the Second Great Awakening, you begin to see the churches getting involved in social concerns, social affairs, fighting for women's rights, fighting to end slavery, trying to curb what they saw as the evil effects of alcohol, helping the poor, establishing Sunday schools to try to attract young people to come to church, right? All of these things that we associated with great American reforms, like women's rights, ending slavery, Sunday school movement, they all come because the churches are competing with each other, because there's a separation between church and state. The reason I bring this up is so often you hear things like, well, separation of church and state is sort of taking religion out of public life, and you're not allowed to speak about faith anymore, and so forth. And there are some concerns about that. I think I've talked about them in a previous class, but I think sometimes the separation of church and state actually allows religion to flourish in a way that it doesn't when there is a close relationship between church and state. So that's what I have for you today. I hope it's enough to sort of at least trigger you to dig a little deeper, but also to have some good questions even for me right now. And I'm going to try to unshare my screen here. And so a little bit to chew on there today. And now, Jack, I'd be happy to take any questions. I think, again, just to review here on our timing, I know some of you need to leave at 9:45, but I will be here till 10. So feel free to move in and out, and then we'll make a kind of hard stop at 10 o'clock. Is that correct, Jack?
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Gallery.
I was going to say, a question for you. It still seems like the question of us being a Christian nation, you gave us a lot of great facts, but it's still debatable because you sort of gave us facts on both sides. which is fine. I mean, it sounds more like an opinion rather than something that's hard and fast. Do you agree with that assessment?
Great. Yeah. And I think I addressed this in the first week, maybe quickly, but I'll bring it back. The idea, was America founded as a Christian nation, is a modern concept. No one was asking this question in the 18th century. It was really not until the late 1970s and the 1980s that people started raising this issue, right? So the answer, yes or no, right? You know, I get that all the time. It's always the first question, right? People want the definitive answer. Yes, we were founded as a Christian nation. No, we were founded. No, we were not founded as a Christian nation. And what I'm trying to get people to see is it's a bad historical question. What I mean by that is you could find evidence on both sides, which I've tried to present here. In the fact, my whole goal has been to complicate this. So whoever asked that question, saying like, you seem to be giving evidence on both sides and you're not answering the question for us, I'm like, great, I did what I wanted to do. I created the fact that this is a much more complex issue than the way it is debated in the sound bites and the talking heads on television and the debates that you hear, right? Now, there's another question that's related to that, which I think I brought this up, is America a Christian nation today? Should we be going back to that, right? And I think what happens there is that both sides of this debate manipulate certain things in history. They just want to, you know, someone, whoever asked this question said, you're giving us both sides, right? Well, you know, if you want to say America is a Christian nation and we should pass policies based on that, make us Christian, more Christian, then you're going to like half of what I said over the last 4 weeks. If you think that's a bad idea, you're going to like the other half of what I said. But I, as a Christian and a historian, have a responsibility to articulate as best as I can what happened in the 18th century and to show how when you manipulate the 18th century to fit some kind of political agenda, whether it be the left or the right, you are manipulating the past and you're not getting a complete perspective. Now, again, in our culture war debates today, that is incredibly unsatisfying. That answer.
Yeah.
But history is complicated and it's very complex. Now, today, you know, I think what the Supreme Court has done is, and this goes back to week one with Emerson, what the Supreme Court has done is it has decided that there is a wall between the separation of church and state. They've taken the 14th Amendment, which says all of the states must conform to the Constitution. The Constitution says religious freedom, you know, no established church. You now must, it's very hard to kind of bring religion into the public life, but it's also very, you know, and people sometimes misinterpret this to believe that, you know, you can't say anything about religion or you can't bring your religious views to bear on things. I would say if you're going to bring your religious views into public life, my argument is you need to be able to articulate your religious views in a way, in a pluralistic society, in a way that people who do not share your religious views can understand and come on board, right? So if you believe that, you might fully believe that, you know, I'll just dive right in here, right? Very controversial. You may believe that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election from Donald Trump, right? As many Americans do. There was corruption, there was fraud, and so forth, right? But you need to bring evidence to prove that. You can't just say, as some Christians I see out there are saying, like, well, I just know because God told me, or I feel God is telling me, right? Or a prophet, some kind of prophet told me that it was stolen. Right? That kind of religious language does not help the republic. The founding fathers would have rejected that. That's why they separated church and state. They don't want people saying like, well, my God told me that, you know, the election's stolen. If you want to prove the election's stolen, then you need to go through the system that the founding fathers created, And, you know, that's what happened, right? 61 cases were brought before judges, and, you know, they were all rejected and so forth. And that's a kind of way in which the founders set it up. They didn't want religious belief influencing, you know, these decisions. So I'll just, you know, I'm kind of going a lot of different directions with that question. It's really, really hard based on what the Supreme Court has done in the last 100 years or so. To claim that America today privileges Christianity over any other religion. But the founding is complex. It's complicated.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bruce. I believe you have a question.
I wonder how the founding fathers, particularly Jefferson, would feel about the inclusion of "In God We Trust" on paper money.
Yeah. The
Pledge of Allegiance under God, and more recently, the National Prayer Breakfast.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. Yeah. Here's how, here's a kind of caveat to start. I think the founding fathers would have had different opinions on this. You mentioned Jefferson. I'll also throw in his buddy in Virginia, James Madison, who they tended to think alike on these things. James Madison and Jefferson, to a degree, really pushed for a complete separation of church and state. James Madison had to be convinced, he had to be dragged kicking and screaming, for there even to be military chaplains, right? He did not even want prayer opening, you know how there's a guy who prays, a chaplain of the Senate and House. He did not want that. He wanted to. Same thing with Jefferson. On the other hand, you had others who thought religion was certainly appropriate. So it depends. John Adams would have certainly. So when you get to these things like "In God We Trust," or, you know, these forms of, in the first week we talked about this, these forms of civil religion, founders would have, you know, would have had mixed views on all of this. National Day of Prayer. I think people like John Adams, George Washington, some of the founders who would have been known later on as Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, John Witherspoon, the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. All of these men would have certainly supported prayer. They would have supported America having a prayer day or fasting. They would have supported this. Jefferson and Madison, on the other hand, would have been very kind of uneasy with these kinds of things. Same thing with "In God We Trust," which was actually not put on under in the Pledge of Allegiance until the 1950s. It used to say the word "under God" was not even there. So a lot of these things, you know, we don't know the answer because they're all dead by this point, but we're just speculating here that, you know, they would have had mixed views on this. But you specifically asked about Jefferson. Jefferson would have had some serious problems with a National Day of Prayer. He actually rejected the idea of having a National Day of Prayer when he was president. You know, because John Adams had no problem with it. Jefferson thought separation of church and state was important. "In God We Trust" and so forth. I think he would have tolerated that kind of stuff, but was not a fan of it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bill, did you have something?
Well, you kind of covered it. I've always just wondered how we've drifted into this attitude that I'll get in trouble saying this again, but a narrow group of people who are very vociferous are trying to lead the country in a specific way. And because many of us are not vociferous and are not out there screaming and shouting, we just kind of like go along, and we're being drugged into an area that we really don't appreciate.
Yeah.
I have never, I kind of like the way Jefferson had stated in the early days. The country was founded on a sense of religious liberty, which meant anybody can do what they want. There is no state-run religion that says this is how we worship. And I can go along with that. That I can accept very easily. But I'm finding that as we go, more and more people are beginning to push what has to be done this way. And this is the only way we can do it, because we stop talking to each other. And that's that's part of this division that I just don't understand. So I've rambled enough.
Yeah. And I think, I could answer this in a lot of different ways, but I think one of the ways that the founders, if they were sitting in on this conversation, if Jefferson or any of the founders, no matter what their position, in light of Bruce's question before about, what their views were on religion, I think all the founders had a certain, and again, I'm being historical here. I'm not trying to make a case one way or the other. I'm just trying to think about the founders in their own time. Many of the founders had a great kind of fear of what today we think of as democracy. And when they talked about democracy, they talked about the rule of the people, right? Many of the founding fathers were well-educated men who worried that if we give this republic over to the uneducated or the common person or the average farmer who doesn't read or doesn't reflect on, follow current events and so forth, then they're going to just respond politically, not based upon the common good of what's good for everybody, because they wouldn't understand what was good for everybody, right? They would want to pass economic laws that help them, that fed them, help their families or whatever. They wouldn't think of the greater good. There was, among every founding father, there's this great worry: do we give power to the mob, to the masses, to the uneducated masses, right? Now, by the early 19th century, that had all changed. The masses had risen up. Democracy began to emerge, much to the chagrin of some of the founding fathers who were still alive. So once you have the people and everybody being able to vote and participate in government, which is, a great thing, right? But then you have people who are able to shape public opinion in the way they want to shape public opinion. And you have people losing, not being as, again, I'm talking here as one of the founding fathers would, not being as virtuous as they should be, because they're only thinking about, democracy, when you think about democracy, it's on one level, it celebrates the dignity of all human beings to participate in government, right? Everybody, as long as you're over 18. On the other hand, democracy is the most selfish form of government anybody could create, because it's all about you and your vote, right? What's going to help me the best? The founding fathers worried about that selfish dimension of democracy, because then people wouldn't be virtuous. And a republic only survives if people, and this reminds you of the book of Judges, right? If people start doing that which was right in their own eyes all the time and don't think about their neighbors and the common good, the republic is going to suffer. And I think what you're seeing now with the bill, with the rise of technology and social media, especially, and cable news, it's enhancing now even more. We're becoming even more democratic. More and more and more people are having a voice, which is, of course, good. But then those voices become easily manipulated, and we just start to manipulate it by others. And again, I'm not talking, you can plug in whoever you want here. You can plug in whatever politician you want. I don't care. But those voices can then be manipulated by others, and you become part of a sort of silo of people who are just talking to each other in their own little social media worlds. They're only watching their network news, not, And I think the founding fathers would have been very, very concerned about that. But they would have also had hope that somehow Christianity might temper that. Good Christians would step in, and they would say, no, this is wrong. Like, we need to be thinking about others too, not just ourselves. But that didn't happen. I think the story is the church did not step in politically and do that. Instead, today you're seeing oftentimes the churches almost enhancing that division by creating their silos. So I'll leave it at that. But I think you make some good points there, Bill.
Anybody else, you can just speak up.
Yeah, I have a question. I know you
That's
talked about
impressive,
like,
Matt. That's impressive. You're driving and following the class. Just be careful.
yeah, I'm experienced cyber school parent. I'm on the road a lot. You talked about like religious liberty being something that kind of tied the fathers together. I think another thing that kind of tied them together that you would probably agree with is that Christianity or religion provided a essential morality for the framework of government and culture. And I wonder what the fathers would do today and what I should do today as an individual where we have such an amoral culture. We see things like, abortion for the sake of birth control. I'm not talking about like complex issues in abortion, but just like people in their mid-20s married that just decide, I don't feel like having this kid. Or, we have websites that promote adultery, where like Ashley Madison's, phrase or motto is life is short, have an affair. And these sort of things that are so amoral, I would think that the founders all would agree that religion provided this sense of morality for both government and culture. And I don't know as an individual what to do about the amoral culture we live in.
Yeah. Here's how I would answer that, Matt. And again, I'm coming at this as a historian, right? And as someone who agrees about the moral problems facing our culture and is completely with you on all of that, I would just argue that our answers to those problems do not lie in turning to the founding fathers. They rely upon turning to the church, to Jesus Christ, to our faith, right? If you want to talk about immoral culture, right, you always need to be careful, right, about invoking the founding fathers. We don't know what the founding fathers' view was on abortion. They never talked about it. It wasn't an issue. Now, universally, abortion was considered immoral at the time, but none of the founding fathers talked about it. The Hippocratic Oath that doctors had to take, had a thing about abortion, right? It's wrong, it's immoral. But if you're going to talk about, the founding fathers respected the human lives of all people, right? And that they were moral people themselves. I mean, you got to be careful. These people were flawed men too. They, when it came to respecting life of the millions of Black slaves in the country, the founding fathers didn't do a great job respecting their lives, right? So, you need to be careful about, another thing you're doing is that, of calling the founding fathers kind of pro-life, or, we need to look back to them. On the other hand, the founding fathers, talked a good game about the role of religion in creating a virtuous republic, but very rarely did they talk about sort of specific moral issues. To them, again, I'll repeat this, what I said earlier, the idea of virtue to them was more a social concept about how we relate to one another. Now, again, the churches, they were very different, right? But the founding fathers were saying, like, religion only is good if it serves the nation, right? So in other words, like if a republic only works if people are virtuous and religious people and other people, but religious people are the best options for serving the nation. So what would the founding fathers have thought about all these moral problems that we see today? I honestly think they would have had, differing opinions on whether, pornography was a good or bad thing. Could you take away, I think they ought to be opposed to pornography, but they would have said that people have the right to have put these videos or whatever out there. I think some of them would have said, like, I disagree with it, but I'm not going to use the government. You know, Jefferson probably would have said, I'm not going to use the government to stop that. They have the right to do that. I morally object to it perhaps, but so I think it's very complicated. But if you want to, I think if as Christians, for us to be salt and light in the world requires us following the teachings of Jesus Christ in the New Testament and the Bible and so forth, and being salt and light, faithfully present in the places God's called us to be faithfully present, and not being too caught up to make sure the founding fathers are or are not on our side, right? I mean, in some ways, separation of church and state can be a good thing, because the church is always a kind of witness to the nation. The church is the bellwether. The church is saying, yes, we can agree with the direction the country's going here, but on this part, we can't, right? We must speak truth to power, on these issues. And we must constantly be speaking truth within a culture that may be morally corrupt in a lot of ways. But I would say, be careful saying and the founding fathers agreed with us because, they thought religion was good, but religion was good for creating a stable republic, not necessarily, they would have differed on the way religion was applied to very specific issues.
I think your last point, this is Kathy speaking. I think your last point is the one that I have gotten out of this series the most, is not to go back and use the founding fathers as justification for our view today. View it, as you're saying, in the historical context, understand it, first of all. Don't just, and people do this with the Bible as well, pick the piece that supports your position and use it. Yeah. This happens in Hershey all the time with Milton Hershey. Mm-hmm. We go back and say, what would Milton Hershey want us to do today? Well, few of us, with the exception of Bruce McKinney, possibly, would know anything about what Milton Hershey would want. Yeah. And not to say, Bruce, you're old enough to have known Milton Hershey, but being raised in the school and everything. So I think that's been one of the things that I have gotten out of this. And I thank you for constantly going back to that point, that understand history, know history. It's very enlightening to where we are today, but don't use it in a way to make a point. I mean, you can, and then using our religion for the greater good. Oh my gosh. Yeah. That is such a debate today with COVID, and now with the CDC's recent idea out there that people don't have to wear masks. So, okay, but what do we need to do for the greater good of people?
And that's what the founding fathers, that I think was the genius of the founders as it relates to Christianity. There were times when the founding fathers' vision of America, right, of people being virtuous, occasionally sacrificing themselves for a greater good, meshes and merges with perhaps the teachings of Christianity. There are some times where the teachings of Christianity directly counter, right? Sometimes as a Christian, you're going to say, no, Milton Hershey, that's not, just because you wanted it, it's not best, it's not good, it's not right. And there might be other times where you say, yes, Milton Hershey, I as a Christian can, but you're always thinking about the world from the perspective of your primary identity as a Christian woman or man or whoever. So I think that's what I'm trying to get Christians to think about when they think about the founding. And I'm glad it came through over the course of the last 4 weeks. History only does so much for us. It's a very limited discipline, right? Now, again, there are certain things that, if you were to say, like, we're going to establish a state church, I mean, then you say, well, hold on a second, history, let's stop. This is not, you can't do this. So I don't want to say history is just completely irrelevant, but I think we have to be careful the way that we use it as Christians, and I think a lot of times we need to remember that these founders were flawed human beings. like we are, right? They weren't demigods in some way. And you know, I think you guys are good Presbyterians out there, right? You believe in human sin. I mean, you should expect the founders to have flaws. So I'll stop there, but I think we're a little over, Jack. But thank you, those of you who are still with us. Thank you so much for your attention, and you know, I appreciate it. It's been fun these last 4 weeks. By the way, I'm in a new setting today. I'm in a hotel in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My daughter just graduated from Calvin University yesterday with a history and psychology major. So that's why I don't have all my books behind me today. I'm doing this from Michigan. So that's Zoom, right? You know, so hopefully next time it'll be face to face though.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Appreciate
Okay,
the
thank
4
you. God
weeks.
bless everybody. Happy Sunday.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
John. See you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, everybody.